Why did my stepdad almost burn our entire family alive? I was doing homework when the lights flickered. Brad, the outlet in my room is sparking again. My stepdad didn't even look up from his beer. Old houses do that, kid. Stop being so dramatic. My mom walked in carrying my baby sister Amelia. Honey, is that burning smell coming from upstairs? Brad's face went red. I told you I'm handling it. We don't need some overpriced electrician for basic wiring. That's when I noticed his toolbox by the attic door. YouTube electrical tutorials paused on his phone screen. But you're not even licensed. I'm the man of this house now. He cut me off. When I say something's fine, it's fine. End of discussion. The burning smell was getting stronger. Amelia's nursery was directly below where he'd been fixing things. At night, I could hear crackling sounds inside the walls, like something alive trying to escape. When I showed Mom the black scorch marks behind my outlet cover, Brad intercepted us. Stop trying to scare your mother. His hand gripped my shoulder hard enough to bruise. You trying to make me look incompetent? Mom just stood there. Brad knows what he's doing, sweetie. Let's not create problems. But I noticed she'd started sleeping with Amelia in her room. Smart. I snuck into the attic when Brad was at work, found exposed wires everywhere, held together with duct tape and prayers. I took photos. Delete those right now. Brad's voice exploded behind me. I nearly fell through the ceiling. You think you're smarter than me, you little punk? This is going to kill us. One more word and I'll take your phone for a year. Your Xbox too. My hands shook as he watched me delete each photo, but I'd already sent them to Dad in Colorado. When Dad called, Brad ripped my phone away. We don't need input from your deadbeat father who abandoned you. That night, the burning smell turned chemical. Sharp, wrong. I couldn't sleep, kept checking on Amelia every hour. Brad had removed all our smoke detector batteries last month, said they were too sensitive and annoying. My chest felt heavy with dread. The next morning, I found char marks spreading across Amelia's ceiling like cancer. Brad, you need to look at this. Get ready for school. Now. His eyes were bloodshot. Empty beer cans littered the coffee table. But the baby's room. I said now. I grabbed my backpack, but not before taking more photos. At school, I showed them to my science teacher. His face went white. This is extremely dangerous. I'm calling. No, I begged. He'll know it was me. Just, can you teach me about electrical fires so I know the warning signs? Mr. Lee spent lunch explaining flashover points, thermal runaway, how quickly fires spread in walls. Every detail made my stomach sink deeper. That afternoon, Brad's truck was gone. I ran straight to Amelia's room. The char marks had doubled in size. The walls were warm to the touch, hot even, like touching a sick person's forehead. The outlet cover in her room had melted into a twisted smile. I was fast asleep at 2 a.m. when I heard a crackling sound. Not normal settling sounds, like 1,000 snakes hissing behind the drywall. Orange light flickered under my door crack. I yanked it open. The smoke hit me instantly. Fire! M-O-M! The house is on fire! Brad stumbled into the hallway in his boxers. Calm down, it's probably just... Then he saw it. Flames eating through the attic door like termites. I can handle this, he said, actually reaching for the doorknob. Just let me... Don't touch it! Mom screamed, finally awake and alert. I was already sprinting to Amelia's room. Her ceiling glowed sunset orange. I snatched her from the crib, her tiny lungs already coughing. We have to go now! But Brad blocked the stairs. If we just contain it to the attic... Move! Mom body checked him like a linebacker. I was already at the front door, Amelia wailing against my chest. Brad was still insisting he could manage the situation, as Mom literally dragged him by his arm. I laid Amelia on the grass and punched 911 into my phone. Fire at Berry Road. My stepdad caused it with illegal wiring. Hurry! Brad lunged at me. You ungrateful little... Mom shoved him backward. You removed our smoke detectors. You almost murdered my children. Glass exploded from the heat. Our entire life was completely up in flames. Fire Chief Pete's report was brutal. Catastrophic electrical failure caused by amateur installation. That boy's quick thinking saved lives. Insurance sent their investigator. Brad's handiwork was obvious. No permits, no license, no payout. They wouldn't cover criminal negligence. Child Protective Services arrived next. 2 counts of reckless child endangerment. Brad tried spinning it. The kids hated me since day one. Probably started it himself. Chief Pete shut him down. Sir, this shows months of dangerous modifications. You're lucky they're alive. Mom filed divorce papers before the ashes cooled. Emergency custody hearing went to Dad. Full rights, effective immediately. They arrested Brad outside family court. Fraud, child endangerment, criminal negligence. Turns out he'd lied about being a contractor. Never held a license in his life. The prosecutor said Amelia's room was 3 minutes from ceiling collapse. Brad got 7 years, but that wasn't enough for what he put us through. So I made sure everyone knew exactly what kind of monster he was. I borrowed Dad's laptop and spent 3 hours building a basic website using a free template. Called it Brad's Victims because that's what we were. I uploaded Fire Chief Pete's official report first, then the court documents showing Brad's charges. The photos of melted outlet covers from Amelia's room made my stomach turn, but I posted them anyway. Added screenshots of Brad's arrest record and his fake contractor claims. Within 2 days, the view counter hit 400, mostly people from our old neighborhood sharing it on Facebook. My phone rang while I was eating cereal, and the caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. The woman introduced herself as Yara Haddad from the newspaper and said she'd seen my website. She wanted to write about dangerous DIY repairs and asked if I'd talk on record. I told her she could use everything, but only if she printed Brad's full name and included his mugshot. We met at a coffee shop downtown where she recorded our whole conversation on her phone. I showed her every photo, every document, explained how Brad removed our smoke detectors. She took notes for 2 hours, asking about warning signs we'd seen before the fire. Sunday morning, Dad brought in the newspaper, and there it was on page 3. Local man's DIY electrical work nearly kills family, stretched across the top with Brad's mugshot right underneath. The article included everything about him ignoring the burning smell and threatening me when I took photos. My phone started buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't know. The third caller introduced himself as Sion Adebayo and said he'd worked construction with Brad 5 years ago. He told me Brad got fired from 3 different job sites for safety violations. Said he had copies of the incident reports and termination letters if I wanted them. Asked if he could go on record about Brad's pattern of putting people in danger. I got Sion's email and forwarded it straight to Yara with his phone number. They talked for an hour and she called me back excited about a follow-up story. The next article ran Wednesday with details about Brad lying to multiple employers about having a contractor license. It mentioned how he'd caused a small fire at one construction site by overloading circuits. Listed 2 other sites where he'd been removed for creating unsafe conditions. Mom called that afternoon and I could hear her crying before she even spoke. People in town were treating her different now that they knew the whole story. She was mad at first, saying I had no right to air our business publicly, but then her voice got quiet and she admitted she should have protected us better. Said people at the grocery store were asking her how she could stay with someone so dangerous. I told her Brad made his choices, and now everyone knew what those choices were. Thursday morning, I got an email from Diego Alvarez at the insurance company. He'd read both articles and wanted to discuss Brad's history with suspicious claims. Turns out our house wasn't the first property Brad had been involved with that had fire damage. Diego asked if I had any documentation from before our fire that might help their investigation. I sent him every photo from my phone, including the ones ones showing Brad's duct-taped wiring in the attic. Included a timeline I'd written down of every incident leading up to the fire. Diego replied saying this could lead to additional fraud charges against Brad. Said it would definitely affect any insurance Brad tried to get in the future. Friday afternoon, a woman named Priya Nair called from a victims' rights organization. She'd been following Brad's case and wanted to help our family access resources. Said they provided free therapy referrals and could help with emergency financial assistance applications. Told me Brad's case was exactly the type they used when pushing for stronger renter protection laws. She emailed me a packet of information about their services and local support groups. The next Monday, Dad picked me up early from the school for our first family therapy appointment. He'd strapped Amelia into her car seat and she was babbling happily with her toy giraffe. The therapist's office had toys scattered around and paintings of mountains on the walls. Dad held Amelia on his lap while I sat in the big leather chair across from them. The therapist explained that even though Amelia was too young to understand what happened, processing trauma together was important. We talked about the night of the fire and how scared we'd all been. I mentioned the website and the articles, how making Brad's actions public felt like taking back some control. I wonder what Brad's real deal is here. Fixing things himself to save money or trying to prove something bigger. This whole man of the house thing while drinking beer and watching YouTube tutorials seems like there's more going on underneath. Dad said he was proud of me for speaking up when adults had failed to protect us. Amelia just played with her giraffe, making happy sounds that made the heavy conversation feel less dark. The therapist gave us exercises to do at home and scheduled our next appointment for the following week. 2 days later, I was scrolling through news about prison systems when I found out Brad got assigned to the electrical shop at the state prison. My hands started shaking as I read the work detail list that someone had posted online. I grabbed a notebook and started writing a letter to the warden right away, explaining everything about the fire and Brad's fake contractor history. Dad helped me print out copies of the fire chief's report and the court documents showing Brad never had any licenses. I stuffed everything in a big envelope and paid for express mail at the post office. The clerk asked if I wanted tracking, and I said yes to everything because I needed proof they got it. 2 weeks passed before an official envelope showed up with the state prison logo on it. The warden wrote that after reviewing Brad's file and my documentation, they immediately reassigned him to kitchen duty with no access to any maintenance areas. He thanked me for bringing the safety concern to their attention and said Brad would never work near electrical systems during his entire sentence. I felt my chest loosen for the first time in weeks, knowing he couldn't mess with wiring anymore. Mom texted me 3 months later saying she finally got her own place and wanted me to visit. Dad drove me over on a Saturday morning to a small apartment complex near the community college. Mom opened the door looking tired but cleaner than I'd seen her in years. She walked me through each room, pointing at the smoke detectors she'd installed herself, one in every single room including the bathroom. She showed me the receipt from a licensed electrician who'd inspected everything before she moved in. The kitchen had a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and another one in the hallway closet. She'd even bought those plug-in carbon monoxide detectors for every outlet near the bedrooms. We sat on her secondhand couch drinking tea when she started crying. She told me she'd been going to therapy twice a week dealing with the guilt of choosing Brad over our safety. Her therapist was helping her understand how Brad manipulated her into ignoring danger signs. She said she should have listened when I showed her those burn marks behind the outlets. Her hands shook as she explained how she'd been too scared of being alone to see what Brad was doing to us. I didn't move to hug her, but I told her I was glad she was getting help and working on herself. 3 months into Brad's sentence, a letter arrived from his lawyer talking about filing an appeal because the sentence was supposedly too harsh for a first offense. Dad immediately called his own lawyer who'd helped with the custody case. They filed a response with every piece of evidence showing Brad's pattern of dangerous behavior over years. The lawyer said Brad's appeal had almost no chance, but we needed to fight it anyway. I spent that night creating a Facebook page called 7 Years Isn't Enough, where I posted statistics about electrical fires killing entire families. Within 3 days, hundreds of people were sharing their own stories about dangerous DIY work that almost killed them. Comments poured in from electricians explaining how Brad's type of wiring could have killed us in our sleep. A woman from Texas messaged me privately about her ex-husband who did the same thing with gas lines instead of electrical work. We talked on the phone for 3 hours as she explained how her ex also removed safety devices and called her dramatic when she worried. She helped me understand this wasn't about being cheap or stupid, but about control and refusing to admit weakness. Her ex got 10 years after their garage exploded and nearly killed their neighbor's kid. She said guys like Brad need to feel powerful even if it means risking their family's lives. The social worker showed up at Dad's apartment for a routine check while I was doing homework with Amelia playing on the floor. She watched Amelia stack blocks and babble to her stuffed animals while taking notes on her clipboard. She commented that Amelia was hitting all her developmental milestones perfectly and seemed really happy at her new daycare. The social worker said most kids who survived house fires showed some trauma signs, but Amelia was thriving. She credited me with getting Amelia out fast enough that she didn't have time to develop fear associations. Before leaving, she mentioned a summer program for teen advocates focused on housing safety and tenant rights. She thought I'd be perfect for it since I'd already shown such strong advocacy skills with the website and social media campaign. I applied that night and got accepted 2 weeks later. Dad said he was proud, and maybe something good could come from our nightmare after all. The program started in June at the State University campus. Walking into the first session, I met 12 other teenagers who'd survived preventable disasters caused by adults who should have protected them. One girl's apartment building collapsed because the landlord ignored foundation cracks for years. A boy from Detroit nearly died from carbon monoxide because his stepdad disabled the detector that kept beeping. Another kid's family got lead poisoning from paint their landlord painted over instead of removing properly. We spent the first day just sharing our stories and realizing how many families go through this stuff. The program coordinators taught us about housing laws and how to document violations before disasters happen. They showed us how to file complaints with the right agencies and when to call news stations for help. We learned that most preventable disasters have warning signs that adults ignore because fixing them costs money or admits failure. One of the program mentors pulled me aside after our workshop on filing official complaints and handed me a thick packet of forms for the state contractor licensing board. She walked me through each section, showing me where to write about Brad's fake contractor claims and all the dangerous work he'd done over the years. I spent 3 hours that afternoon filling out every detail I could remember, attaching copies of the fire report and court documents that proved he'd never held any license. The mentor reviewed my complaint and helped me add legal terms that would get their attention. Then we sent it certified mail with tracking to make sure they couldn't ignore it. 2 weeks later, I got an official letter saying they'd opened a full investigation into Brad's fraudulent work history and would be contacting previous employers and clients. My phone buzzed while I was reading the letter, and Mom's name popped up with a text saying she'd started seeing someone new, a firefighter named Arnold, who actually understood why she checked smoke detectors 3 times before bed. She said he'd installed extra ones in her apartment and taught her how to use a fire extinguisher properly, which made me feel better even though I wasn't ready to meet him yet. I texted back that I was glad she was moving forward and finally finding someone who took safety seriously. Diego called me the next morning while I was eating breakfast at Dad's kitchen table, his voice excited as he explained that Brad was charged with 3 separate counts of insurance fraud from claims he'd filed years before our fire. He said investigators found a pattern where Brad would cause damage doing his fake repairs, then file insurance claims saying it was normal wear and tear or acts of nature. The evidence showed he'd collected almost $40,000 over 5 years from different insurance companies, always moving to new insurers before they caught on. Diego needed me to testify about the photos I'd taken and what I'd witnessed Brad doing in our attic, since my documentation from before the fire was key evidence that showed his intent to deceive. 3 months later, I sat in Dad's living room with my laptop open for the video link to Brad's insurance fraud trial, my hands shaking as I waited for my turn to testify. The prosecutor walked me through each photo I'd taken, asking me to describe what I saw and when Brad had done the work, while Brad sat at the defendant's table in his orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I remembered. I explained how he'd threatened me when he caught me documenting the dangerous wiring and forced me to delete photos from my phone, not knowing I'd already sent copies to Dad. The prosecutor thanked me and said my evidence was crucial because it showed Brad knew his work was dangerous, but continued anyway to avoid paying professionals. When the verdict came back 2 weeks later, Brad was found guilty on all 3 fraud counts, with the judge adding 4 more years to his sentence for a total of 11 years in prison. Dad hugged me tight when we heard the news, saying justice was finally being served, even though part of me wished it could be even longer for everything he'd put us through. Yara published her final article about Brad's additional conviction the next day, including quotes from 5 other families who'd hired him for work that ended up causing thousands in damage. The online comment section filled up fast with people sharing their own stories about dangerous DIY work and contractors who lied about licenses, with some saying Brad's case made them check their own contractor's credentials. Dad sat me down that weekend and showed me a savings account he'd opened for me and Amelia, using money from selling the few things that survived the fire, including some jewelry and electronics that were in a fireproof safe. He'd already put away $8,000 and promised to keep adding to it every month, so we'd both have money for college without loans. How did the narrator figure out Brad was working in the electrical shop at prison? That's such a smart move, checking work details online. I'm really curious what made them think to look that up in the first place. That night, I woke up at 2 a.m. from a nightmare about the fire, my sheets soaked with sweat as I heard those phantom crackling sounds from inside the walls again. I used the grounding technique my therapist taught me, naming 5 things I could see in my room, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, and 1 thing I could taste. My breathing slowed down as I reminded myself I was safe in Dad's apartment with working smoke detectors and proper wiring, that Brad was locked up and couldn't hurt anyone else. The nightmares were getting less frequent, even though they never completely went away, and I was learning to manage them better each time. A thick envelope arrived from the contractor licensing board 3 weeks later, with their final ruling that Brad was permanently banned from any construction or electrical work in the entire state. They'd added his name and photo to a public database of fraudulent contractors that homeowners could check before hiring anyone, with a big red warning about his criminal convictions. The letter said they'd also sent notices to hardware stores and supply companies warning them not to sell professional materials to him once he got out of prison. Mom sent me a photo that afternoon of her and 3 neighbors from her new apartment building standing next to a bulletin board they'd just installed in the lobby. She'd organized the whole thing herself, filling it with pamphlets about home safety, lists of legitimate licensed contractors with good reviews and warning signs of dangerous electrical problems. Her text said she was becoming an advocate in her own way, making sure other families wouldn't go through what we did because they didn't know better. 3 weeks later, Mr. Lee asked if I wanted to do a special presentation for my science class about electrical fires, and I jumped at the chance. I spent days putting together slides showing thermal imaging photos, chemical reaction diagrams, and statistics about home electrical fires that kill thousands every year. The morning of my presentation, my hands shook as I set up my laptop, but once I started talking about flashover points and how quickly fires spread through walls, everything clicked into place. I showed them the melted outlet cover from Amelia's room that I'd kept as evidence, passed around samples of different wire gauges, and explained how Brad's duct tape connections created resistance that generated heat until ignition happened. Mr. Lee sat in the back row nodding along, and when I finished, he stood up first to clap, telling the whole class how my knowledge saved my family's life. That afternoon, I found an email from Siyun waiting in my inbox with the subject line, "Changes at the company," and my heart started racing. He explained that Brad's old construction company had implemented new rules requiring all workers to show their licenses every 3 months after what happened to us made the news. The owner had personally called Siyun to thank him for coming forward about Brad's history because it pushed them to fix their verification system before someone else got hurt. 2 days later, Priya called from the victims' rights organization, asking if I'd be willing to speak at their annual fundraiser next month about the importance of documenting dangerous situations and speaking up even when adults don't listen. My stomach twisted at the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people, but I said yes because maybe our story could save another family from going through this nightmare. Dad helped me practice my speech every night for 3 weeks, timing me and giving feedback on which parts hit hardest. The night of the fundraiser, I wore my only nice dress and gripped my note cards so tight they got damp from sweat. The ballroom was packed with donors and survivors, and when they called my name, my legs felt like jelly walking to the podium. I started strong, explaining the timeline of Brad's dangerous work, but when I got to the part about Amelia's room being 3 minutes from ceiling collapse, my voice cracked and tears started falling. The whole room went silent as I tried to pull myself together, and then suddenly everyone was on their feet applauding, and I managed to finish through the tears. After I stepped down, at least 20 people came up to share their own stories about contractors who lied, landlords who ignored safety issues, and family members who put everyone at risk through pride and stupidity. A woman in a navy suit approached me near the dessert table and introduced herself as a state representative who'd been working on housing safety legislation for 2 years without much support. She grabbed my hand and said she wanted to name the bill after Amelia because our story showed exactly why annual safety inspections for rental properties needed to be mandatory. We exchanged numbers and she promised to call me about testifying at the state capitol, which made my head spin because I was just a teenager trying to protect my sister. 2 weeks later, Dad took time off work to drive me to the legislative building where we met with 3 different representatives in their wood-paneled offices covered in flags and certificates. I told our story 3 times that day, each time getting better at hitting the key points about removed smoke detectors, ignored warning signs, and Brad's lies about his qualifications. One representative pulled up Brad's mugshot on his computer while I talked and shook his head saying this was exactly the kind of preventable tragedy their committee needed to hear about. By the end of the day, all 3 had committed to supporting what they were calling Amelia's Law, and one even suggested adding criminal penalties for landlords who disable safety equipment. Dad squeezed my shoulder as we walked back to the car and said he'd never been prouder of anyone in his life. Mom called that night practically screaming with excitement because she'd just seen the local news do a whole segment on the the proposed law with our family's story as the centerpiece. The reporter had interviewed Fire Chief Pete, who held up his original report and said I was a hero for documenting everything and acting fast when adults failed to protect us. Mom said people at her apartment complex had already started talking about it and asking her for advice about checking their own homes for problems. A week later, Dad handed me an envelope that had arrived from the state prison with Brad's inmate number in the corner and asked if I wanted to read it or just throw it away. I took it to the backyard, lit a fire in the metal fire pit with the flue wide open and a fire extinguisher sitting right next to me, then dropped the unopened letter into the flames. Watching his words turn to ash felt like closing a door on that part of my life, even though I knew the nightmares would keep coming for years. 6 months passed with therapy sessions and court dates and legislative meetings before Amelia looked up at me one morning and said clear as day, "Sissy saved me," which made Dad and I both start crying right there at the breakfast table. She was only 3 but somehow understood that I'd protected her from something terrible and would grow up knowing she mattered enough for someone to fight for her safety. That same week, Diego called with news that Brad's insurance fraud charges had inspired 4 other families to come forward with their own stories about his dangerous work and lies over the past decade. The civil lawsuit was growing bigger every day with more victims joining, and even though Brad was already in prison for 11 years, these families deserved compensation for what he'd put them through. Priya sat across from us at Dad's kitchen table with a stack of legal papers that made my stomach tight. She pushed the documents toward us and explained how emotional distress claims worked for minors in situations like ours. Dad signed as my guardian while I watched her highlight sections about unsafe living conditions and child endangerment. The paperwork took 3 hours to complete with every detail about Brad's electrical work documented. Priya said any settlement money would go straight into trust accounts for therapy and college expenses. She filed everything at the courthouse the next morning while I was at the school. Mom called me that night to say she'd joined a support group at the community center. She went to meetings every Tuesday where other people talked about their experiences with dangerous partners. The facilitator helped them understand manipulation tactics and how abusers made them ignore warning signs. Mom said hearing other stories made her realize Brad had followed a pattern she couldn't see at the time. She cried when she told me about another woman whose husband had done similar things with gas lines. The group was teaching her to recognize red flags she'd missed for years. Summer ended and I walked into my senior year feeling different from before. My guidance counselor pulled me aside the first week to talk about college applications. She said my story about saving my family would make powerful essay material. I spent lunch periods in the library writing draft after draft about that night. The words came easier than I expected because I'd lived through every terrifying second. My English teacher read my essay and said colleges would fight over someone with my courage. Kids at the school treated me differently too after the news coverage about the proposed law. They asked questions about the fire and what prison was like for Brad. I answered honestly, but kept some details private because Amelia didn't need her story spread everywhere. 3 months into the school year, Priya called with news about the civil suit. Brad's lawyer wanted to settle out of court to avoid a trial. His few assets would be liquidated, including his truck and tools. The money wasn't much after splitting between all the families, but that wasn't the point. Brad's letter from prison showing up makes me wonder what he was trying to accomplish from behind bars. Apologize, threaten, or manipulate one more time. The fact that the narrator burned it without reading seems like the smartest choice, but I'm curious what motivated him to even write after everything he'd done. What mattered was the legal record showing Brad had harmed multiple victims. The judge approved the settlement and checks arrived 2 weeks later. Dad deposited mine and Amelia's portions directly into our college funds. Mom got her share too and used it to pay for more therapy sessions. Spring arrived with incredible news from the state capitol. The House had voted on Amelia's law with only 3 representatives opposing it. The safety inspection requirements would protect thousands of families from dangerous landlords. The representative who sponsored the bill called personally to invite us to the signing ceremony. She said our story had convinced even skeptical lawmakers to support the measure. A framed copy of the bill arrived by special delivery the next week. Dad hung it in our living room next to Amelia's baby pictures. The governor's office scheduled the signing ceremony for a Thursday morning in May. Dad took time off work and dressed Amelia in her nicest outfit. We drove to the Capitol building where news crews had already set up cameras. The governor gave a speech about protecting vulnerable families from preventable tragedies. He mentioned our family by name and called me a hero for speaking up when adults failed. I held Amelia during the photo session while she played with my hair. Reporters asked questions, but Dad fielded most of them to protect our privacy. The governor signed 3 copies of the bill with different pens. He gave one pen to me and whispered that I should be proud of what I'd accomplished. Amelia grabbed for the pen and everyone laughed, which made the front page photo perfect. 2 weeks after the ceremony, Mom asked to meet me at a coffee shop. She looked healthier than she had in years with color back in her face. We sat outside watching people walk by while she gathered her thoughts. She said she needed to talk about forgiveness, but not for Brad. She wanted us to forgive each other for what happened during those terrible months. I hadn't realized how much anger I'd been carrying toward her for not protecting us. She hadn't realized how much guilt was eating her alive for choosing Brad over our safety. We didn't hug or cry like in movies, but something shifted between us. The weight felt lighter even though we both knew healing would take years. Dad called the next month with exciting news about his job. His boss had promoted him to regional manager with a big raise. We could finally move out of the cramped apartment into something better. He found a place with a yard where Amelia could play safely. Before signing the lease, he brought an electrician to inspect every outlet and wire. The inspector checked everything twice while Dad took notes and photos. We moved in July with Dad testing every smoke detector personally. He'd bought extras to install in hallways and the basement. Amelia ran through the yard chasing butterflies while we unpacked boxes. November brought my early admission letter from my dream college. The envelope felt heavy in my hands as I tore it open. They'd accepted me with a scholarship for student advocates and social justice work. The admissions committee specifically mentioned my work on Amelia's law in their decision. Dad whooped so loud that Amelia started clapping without knowing why. I'd gotten into 3 other schools too, but this one felt right. The scholarship would cover most expenses so Dad wouldn't struggle with tuition. That same week, we got notice about Brad's first parole hearing. Multiple victims had submitted impact statements explaining why he should serve his full sentence. The parole board reviewed everything, including the civil lawsuit and insurance fraud convictions. They denied his request in less than 10 minutes of deliberation. Brad would serve all 11 years, which gave us time to rebuild without looking over our shoulders. Mom called me 3 weeks later with news that shocked me. She'd enrolled in an electrician training program at the community college. The classes ran 4 nights a week plus Saturdays. She had to learn electrical codes, safety protocols, and hands-on wiring techniques. Her instructor was tough and didn't go easy on anyone. Mom studied at the kitchen table every night with textbooks spread everywhere. She practiced bending conduit in the garage until her hands were raw. The other students were mostly young guys who looked at her funny at first. She failed her first exam and almost quit. But then she thought about Amelia's room and those melted outlets. She studied harder and passed the makeup test with an 88. Meanwhile, my website about Brad kept getting messages from other families. A woman in Ohio sent photos of her husband's dangerous plumbing work. A teenager in Texas documented his dad's illegal roof repairs. Each story followed the same pattern of pride and stubbornness. I helped them file reports with local authorities, connected them with lawyers who understood construction fraud. 12 families got justice because they found my site. Their messages made our nightmare mean something. Spring came and Amelia started preschool at the church down the street. Dad was nervous about leaving her with strangers. The teacher said she was bright and social during her first week. She made friends instantly and loved story time. No signs of trauma from the fire. Kids really do bounce back when you protect them fast enough. Her teacher pulled Dad aside to say Amelia was ahead developmentally. She could count to 20 and knew all her colors. The fire hadn't stolen her future. Senior year flew by with college applications and final exams. My grades stayed perfect despite everything we'd been through. The school picked me as valedictorian in April. I spent weeks writing my graduation speech. The auditorium was packed on graduation day. Parents fanned themselves with programs in the June heat. When I got to the podium, my hands shook slightly. I talked about speaking up when adults put others in danger. Never mentioned Brad's name, but everyone knew. The crowd gave me a standing ovation. Dad filmed the whole thing while Amelia clapped from his lap. After graduation, Priya called about a summer internship at her organization. They helped young survivors navigate the legal system. I'd be working with kids who'd been through similar nightmares. The office was downtown in an old brick building. My first day, I met 3 other interns with their own survival stories. We spent mornings learning about victim rights and court procedures. Afternoons, we answered phones and helped families fill out paperwork. One girl called crying because her uncle had beaten her. I walked her through getting a restraining order. Another boy needed help testifying against his mother's boyfriend. Each case reminded me why this work mattered. Priya taught us how to stay strong while helping others. By August, I'd helped 20 families start their legal journeys. Mom called in September with amazing news. She'd passed her final electrician certification exam. The test covered everything from residential wiring to commercial installations. She scored in the top 10% of her class. A company that fixed homes for low-income families hired her immediately. They specialized in correcting dangerous electrical work. Her first week, she rewired a house where kids were living with exposed wires. The family cried when she showed them the new smoke detectors. Mom found her purpose through our pain. She was saving other families from what we went through. One Saturday in October, Dad suggested we drive to our old neighborhood. I hadn't been back since the fire. Amelia sat in her car seat playing with toys. The drive took 40 minutes through familiar streets. Our old lot sat empty between 2 houses. Wildflowers grew where our kitchen used to be. Purple ones pushed through the foundation cracks. Dad held Amelia while I walked the perimeter. The basement stairs were still visible under dead leaves. We didn't stay long, but seeing it helped. That chapter was really closed now. The land would heal and maybe another family would build there. They'd never know what happened unless they looked up property records. 2 weeks before leaving for college, I started packing my room. Old boxes from the move held things we'd saved. In one box, I found a manila folder I'd forgotten about. Inside were the photos Mr. Lee helped me take of the fire damage. Black char marks spreading across white ceilings. Melted outlet covers twisted into grotesque shapes. These pictures helped convict Brad twice. They changed state law to protect other families. One teenager refusing to stay silent protected countless others. I put the photos in my college box as a reminder. Sometimes speaking up costs everything, but staying quiet costs even more. Thanks for hanging out and exploring with me today. It's been such a fascinating ride. Until our paths cross again, subscribe for more content like this.